The boy was born beneath the grey skies of the Illyrian highlands, in a valley cradled between thick pine forests and jagged limestone cliffs. His people, the Darcy, were mountain dwellers, fierce, independent, and intimate with the land. They knew no city walls, no marble statues, no mosaic floors, only the rhythms of the earth, the planting of barley in spring, the hunting of wild boar in autumn, the singing of wind through the mountain passes, and the hush of snowfall that cloaked the land in winter silence. His mother named him Tiro, not for the Roman word for novice, though fate would give it bitter irony, but from the tongue of her grandmothers it meant oak-born. He came into the world in a timber hut with a thatched roof, warmed by a central hearth and guarded by family. The village elder cut the cord with a flint knife, and his grandmother wept and smeared ash on her cheeks, tears of joy and prayers for protection from Roman eyes. His father, Veton, was a blacksmith and war singer, a man of hard hands and a voice that could echo through the woods. Tiro grew up hearing his father shape iron into spearheads while humming ancient chants, verses that praised the gods of rivers and fire. His mother, Lada, gathered herbs and midwifed the neighbouring villages. They lived simply, yet richly, by the scale of the wild, furs to warm them, goat milk to nourish, and stories to teach right from wrong. From his earliest days, Tiro was taught not to fear pain, to speak softly to animals, and to never turn his back on the mountain. At 5, he learned to snare birds. At 6, he helped the older boys gather pine resin and chase off wolves from the goat pens. At 7, he carved a small flute from elder wood and played for his baby sister under the stars. By 8, he was learning how to throw a javelin. There were no books in Tiro's village. Knowledge passed mouth to ear, hand to hand. The old women knew which mushrooms were deadly, the men knew which bark cured fever, and the children knew that the smoke rising beyond the far hilltop meant trouble. That smoke, in the end, was the beginning of the end. The Romans had long extended their shadow over Illyria, building roads, levying tribute, and taking men as auxiliaries. But the Dorsi were highland folk. They paid no coin and bent no knee. One winter evening, while snow still rimmed the valley edges, a band of traders arrived, speaking Latin, offering salt and bronze. They brought woolen cloaks and clay amphorae of wine, which they poured freely around the fire. They laughed, told stories of the great city of Rome, and gave the children sweetened figs. The villagers, in their trust, shared food and drink. The next morning, Tiro awoke to screams. The village had been betrayed. Fire licked the thatched roofs. Armed men stormed through the narrow lanes, dragging women by their hair, cutting down those who resisted. The traders were no merchants. They were slavers, working with local mercenaries, and sanctioned by a Roman negotiator, Venelicius, a dealer in human flesh. Tiro was thrown into a cart alongside 10 others. He could still hear his mother's voice calling for him, fading into the smoke. His father was never seen again. Bound in iron shackles, gagged with coarse cloth, and packed among crying children and silent men, he began the long journey southward, through unfamiliar woods, along dusty roads, past the crumbling ruins of places his people had only whispered about. His hands bled from rope burn, his lips cracked from thirst. His childhood ended before his 9th year. The boy from the mountains would soon meet the Marble Empire. The days that followed, blurred into one long, shuddering memory of dust, hunger, and the groaning of wooden wheels. The cart was crude, little more than a box of boards nailed atop creaking axles, with iron bars across the top to keep the captives in. Tiro lay shoulder to shoulder with other children, some whimpering, others staring blankly into the horizon. They were Illyrians, Dacians, and a Gaulish girl who spoke no words at all. Above them a coarse linen tarp offered little shelter from the rain or sun. The Slavas drove their oxen steadily southward, along winding roads carved by Roman hands and trodden by centuries of marching legions. At night they camped in the open, no fires, only silence and the smell of wet cloth and fear. The men who guarded them spoke Latin, though with the coarse edge of low-born soldiers. They called Tiro puer bestia, beast boy, and spat near him when he coughed. On the 6th day, they reached a Roman outpost, where the captives were washed in icy water and shaved to the scalp. They were examined by a man in a crimson-edged toga, who pinched their arms and teeth with metal tongs, and nodded or frowned. Some of the older captives were taken away that night and never returned. By the time they reached Capua, a city known for its markets, amphitheatre, and brutal efficiency, Tiro had grown silent. His eyes watched everything: the red-tiled roofs, the buzzing marketplaces, the towers of smoke from bathhouses and forges. Never had he seen so many people, some laughing, some shouting, all walking with purpose. The streets were alive with colour, but to Tiro it all seemed like a dream wrapped in nightmare. They were led to the slave pens near the Forum Venalium, a marketplace dedicated to the buying and selling of human beings. The pens were stinking enclosures of iron and stone, filled with people of every shade and tongue: Nubians, Britons, Greeks, Syrians, and countless provincials. Some cried, some prayed, some tried to barter with guards. Tiro stayed quiet and watched. On the morning of his auction, he was scrubbed, oiled, and forced to stand naked with a chalk sign hanging from his neck. It listed his age, health, and origin. A red ribbon was tied to his right wrist. He did not yet understand. This meant he was recommended, a sign of good health and obedience. He did not know his price was expected to be high. Nearby, an older slave explained in whispers how prices were set. Boys who looked strong could fetch up to 3,000 sesterces. Girls of beauty, even more. Educated Greeks went for 10 times that amount, especially if they knew letters or music. Dull-witted or deformed captives were sold for labor or the mines, and rarely lived long. The crowd gathered like spectators to a sport: wealthy women, toga-clad senators, merchants in dyed tunics. They poked and prodded, lifting chins, inspecting teeth, commanding captives to turn or speak. Tiro felt the sting of humiliation as one buyer demanded to see his back and another yanked his arm to check for muscle. When his turn came, a small platform was wheeled forward. He stood atop it in the morning sun, heart pounding. The auctioneer's voice boomed. Illyrian boy, 9 years old, strong for his age, healthy, silent and observant, perfect for household service. The bidding began with lazy flicks of fingers. 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. A woman with a veil raised the price to 2,200. Then a tall man in a dark blue tunic clavus, an expensive garment with wide purple stripes, lifted his hand. 3,000, he said. The crowd quieted. The woman withdrew her bid. Sold, barked the auctioneer. to Gaius Livius Faustus of the House of the Laurel. That was the first time Tiro heard the name of the man who would own his life. His wrists were shackled again, this time with a softer grip. The steward of the House of Faustus approached, an older Greek with kind eyes and a deliberate walk. He placed a firm hand on Tiro's shoulder. "You belong to a great house now, boy," he said in Greek. "You must learn quickly and speak little, and you may live." As they left the forum, the sunlight gleamed off the rooftops of Capua, but to Tiro it felt like a sunset. He did not know then that the House of the Laurel was one of the grandest estates in the Southern Empire, nor did he know that it would be the only home he'd know for decades. All he knew, as the city disappeared behind him and the villa's hilltop silhouette rose in the distance, was that he was no longer free, and that survival would depend on obedience, silence, and the careful study of men. The road to the villa twisted through cypress-lined avenues, where the air grew heavy with rosemary and dust. Tiro sat atop a mule-drawn cart beside the steward, whose name he would later learn was Menander. Though Menander spoke little, he offered the boy a dried fig and a water skin during the journey. It was the first act of quiet kindness Tiro had encountered since his capture. As they approached the estate, Tiro's eyes widened. Before him rose not a house, but a world unto itself, Domus Augusta, the Villa of the Laurels, seat of the powerful Gaius Livius Faustus. It sprawled across a terraced hill like a marble crown, overlooking the fertile plains of Campania. The villa was a symphony of stone and order, wrapped in porticos and crowned with red terracotta roofs that glinted under the afternoon sun. The outer walls, high and austere, bore sculpted garlands and reliefs of victories won by men long dead. A double gate of bronze, embossed with scenes from the Iliad, parted at their arrival. Inside, the air changed. It grew cooler, perfumed, still. The path split into 3 avenues. One led toward the agricultural fields, where rows of olive trees and grapevines stretched into the horizon. Another dipped toward the stables and servant quarters. The third, paved in pale travertine, ascended to the main villa, framed by a grand colonnade. The main structure was built around a large atrium, open to the sky, its central basin catching rainwater in a gleaming impluvium. Mosaic floors depicted Neptune riding dolphins and Bacchus drunk with joy. Statues of Minerva and Apollo stood guard at the corners. A servant, barefoot and silent, scattered rose petals in the air before visitors entered. Beyond the atrium lay the tablinum, where the master received guests and conducted business, its walls painted with frescoes of mythic beasts and wars. Scrolls lined the shelves. The scent of ink, beeswax, and cedar lingered in the air. To the left stood the triclinium, a grand dining hall with 3 reclining couches for feasting. The ceilings were coffered with gold leaf, and an elaborate marble fountain trickled into a mosaic basin shaped like a seashell. To the right were the cubiculum, bedrooms of polished marble and silk-draped couches. Here, Tiro would serve, fetching cloaks, preparing hot water, folding tunics, polishing sandals. Further still were the private baths, their floors heated by the hypocaust system, an intricate underfloor network of fire-warmed air ducts that kept the caldarium, tepidarium, and frigidarium at perfect Roman temperatures. Tiro was awed by the humming heat from below, and the way mist rose from the water like a god's breath. The villa's library held scrolls in Latin and Greek, many unread by their owners, but revered for their presence. The lararium, a small shrine near the kitchen, held tiny figurines of household gods, Lares and Penates, where incense burned each morning. Outside, the villa was encircled by peristyle gardens, rich with jasmine, lavender, and sculpted hedges. Bronze bird baths glimmered beside topiary, shaped like mythical beasts. Turtles ambled between fountains, and peacocks strolled the flagstones like royal guests. In the lower grounds sat the Villa Rustica, the estate's working wing, where slaves tended cattle, pressed olives, and stored grain in immense clay dolia. There was also a pistrina, a bakery, where slaves ground grain into flour with basalt wheels, and a culliner near the atrium, where meals for the master were prepared over open flames. The slave quarters were modest stone rooms along the northern wall, windowless, clean, yet stark. Here, Tiro would sleep, side by side with others on woven straw mats. There was one blanket to share for every 2 boys, and the smell of sweat, oil, and damp limestone hung in the air. Every hour of the day was scheduled, meals at the clang of the bell, labor marked by the sun's angle. The villa ran like a machine, smooth and beautiful, because every cog, every slave, knew his place. Tiro's heart beat faster, with each step deeper into the Domus Augusta. He would learn its secrets, its rhythms, and its dangers. It was vast, powerful, and filled with beauty, but none of it was his. Not the garden's figs, not the bath's warm water, not the silk sheets he would fold, but never touch. Still, something inside him stirred, not fear, but fire. If this was to be his prison, he would learn its every corner, every room, every habit, every face, and someday, he dared not yet whisper it, he would use that knowledge to earn his freedom. The first time Tiro laid eyes on Gaius Livius Faustus, the man who owned him, the master was seated beneath a pergola of grapevines, dictating letters to a scribe. He was not young, but neither was he aged. A man in the prime of his Roman life, perhaps in his late 40s. His shoulders were broad, his arms strong despite the softness in his middle, and his skin had the bronzed hue of someone who spent time both indoors with scrolls and outdoors surveying his land. His tunic was of fine Egyptian linen, white with a purple clavus stitched down the center, subtle but unmistakable in its message of class. A gold signet ring glinted on his right hand. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes, sharp, slate grey, missed nothing. Tiro knelt when Menander approached the pergola and whispered in Latin, "The new boy from Capua, Dominus." Gaius looked up, measured the boy silently for several heartbeats, then turned back to his scribe. "Let him be scrubbed again," he said. "Oil his skin. I don't want him to stink of pens. If he learns quickly, he'll be of use." He didn't say of use to me, only of use, as though Tiro were a jar or a sponge, an item waiting to be classified by utility. Gaius Livius Faustus was a man of old senatorial blood, though his branch of the family had risen anew through clever political marriages and heavy grain exports. He had served as questor in Sicily, then praetor peregrinus in Rome. Now semi-retired to Campania, he managed vast agricultural estates and lent money to other patricians at profitable rates. He had 3 children by a wife, long since dead, Lucilla, his eldest daughter, raised to be elegant, sharp-tongued, and marriageable, Marcus, his only son, 17, and spoiled with the recklessness of youth, Tertia, the youngest, barely 5, often seen toddling after her nursemaid through the peristyle. His authority in the villa was absolute. No door opened without his command. No purchase was made, no scroll read aloud, no fig plucked from the tree without someone first wondering, would the dominos approve? But Gaius was not cruel for cruelty's sake. He believed in order, in symmetry, in loyalty, bought and earned. He did not whip slaves for sport, as some Roman nobles did, but he expected silence, precision, and total devotion. He could smile with warmth 1 hour and order a flogging the next, and think both acts equally just. The villa, like Rome itself, mirrored the master's will. Every person had a place. Menander, the elderly steward, managed affairs inside the domus. Nicia, a sharp-eyed freedwoman, oversaw the kitchen and the female slaves. Paulus, the villicus, ruled the fields and animals with a staff and a growl. Tiro was assigned to Menander's staff. He would work inside the master's wing, a shadow among shadows, cleaning sandals, fetching scrolls, laying out the master's clothing, preparing oil lamps at dusk, and standing silently beside him during meals, ready with water or a cloth. At night, he was taught Latin phrases, instructed to observe the rhythms of the master's life, when he woke, when he bathed, how he liked his sandals arranged. He learned that Gaius disliked citrus, but loved honeyed dates, that he used his left hand to drink and always took 2 paces before beginning a conversation, that he hummed softly when thinking. Tiro soon saw that to be close to the master was to live in a strange limbo. He heard conversations that no other slave did, plans for trade, letters from senators, the rustle of forbidden books, yet he was never acknowledged unless needed. Gaius never addressed him by name. He was expected to be like a table, always present, always useful, never speaking. And yet, Gaius noticed everything. When Tiro folded his tunic with sharp corners, Gaius once nodded faintly. When he placed the wrong sandal at the wrong time, Gaius spoke not to him, but to Menander. "Is the boy dull?" That night, Tiro was made to recite the layout of the atrium blindfolded. The master's approval was a distant light, rare, brief, but powerful. Many slaves reshaped their entire beings in the hope of feeling its warmth. Tiro, too, began to reshape, not to earn love. He had long since abandoned the dream of affection, but for survival, for worth, and perhaps one day for the slimmest chance of freedom. He was a boy no longer. He was a tool, polished and kept sharp, and he was watching. The familia Savorum, the family of slaves, was an empire within the villa, a hidden world with its own customs, rivalries, and codes. Though they were owned, nameless in the eyes of law, the slaves of Domus Augusta formed a society as intricate and alive as the city of Rome itself. There were nearly 100 slaves on the estate, divided between the Villa Urbana, the Villa Rustica, and the Villa Fructuaria. Some had been born into the household. Others, like Tiro, had been bought, traded, or inherited. All of them served the will of Gaius Livius Faustus. For a boy like Tiro, newly purchased and barely 9, the household loomed like a forest of moving giants. He was small, unfamiliar with Roman customs, and uncertain of the spoken Latin that twisted differently in each mouth. Still, the rules of his new world revealed themselves quickly, and they were harsh but clear. Every slave had a place. The lines were rigid. Domestici were the house slaves like Tiro, who served inside the villa. Their roles included bedroom attendants, doorkeepers, lamplighters, and sandal bearers. Some of the older boys carried basins of scented water. Others folded tunics with practiced precision. Tiro was made a bedroom attendant, a cubicularius, assigned to the master's personal wing and placed under the eye of Menander. In the kitchen, chaos and heat ruled. Overseen by Nicia, the sharp-eyed freedwoman, it was a world of fire, grease, and bruised fingers. Slaves stirred great pots of barley, chopped onions until their eyes ran dry, and plucked geese in silence. The head cook, a broad-shouldered Gaul named Brannus, swung a ladle like a club and barked orders in Latin laced with curses. The field workers were rarely seen by the house slaves. They rose before the sun, dragged iron ploughs behind oxen, and returned at dusk, their hands cracked and calloused, their backs bent. These were the lowest of the low, their labor heavy, their lives short. Tiro knew that one mistake could send him there. There were also the skilled slaves, masons who patched the villa walls, carpenters who repaired furniture, blacksmiths who fixed tools, and scribes who copied letters and records. These were silent, focused men whose eyes rarely met others. Most hoped to earn their freedom one day, some through savings, some by winning favor. And above them all, the trusted few, Menander, the steward, Paulus, the villicus, and Nicia. Their word could decide a slave's fate. Menander rarely raised his voice, but when he spoke, everyone listened. Paulus was a heavy man with quick anger and quicker punishments. Nicia saw everything and forgot nothing. Among the slaves, status was everything. To be closer to the master was to live slightly better, eat slightly more, and suffer slightly less. Those in the master's inner wing walked a tightrope, privileged enough to be near power, yet constantly watched. Tiro's arrival did not go unnoticed by the others. He was young, foreign, and newly purchased at a high price. That meant two things: attention and resentment. Older boys mocked his rough Latin and mimicked his mountain accent. One, a Macedonian named Silurus, tripped him while he was carrying a pitcher of bath water, causing it to crash into the mosaic floor. Menander only raised an eyebrow, but that night Tiro had to polish every bronze lamp in the villa's east wing before sleeping. Yet not all were cruel. A slender girl named Amma, who worked in the kitchen, whispered to him in the hallway, "They'll test you. Pass the tests. Make no friends, no enemies, not yet." Tiro took her words to heart. He learned quickly. He rose before the sun. He folded tunics so the creases were sharp. He oiled sandals until they shone. He carried water without spilling and lit lamps without smoke. He learned not to react to insults, not to answer back. The less they saw of him, the better. But he watched everything. He learned that Brannus, for all his fury, cried when he thought no one watched, always after receiving letters from a son sold away. He saw that Paulus had a mistress among the field slaves, and that Menander, when he believed himself alone, knelt before the lararium and whispered in Greek. And late at night, in the cramped quarters where straw mats lay in rows, the slaves would whisper prayers to gods the Romans did not know. old mountain spirits, river ghosts, and gods of darkness and pain. One old woman traced strange symbols into the dust before sleeping. Another sang lullabies in a tongue Tiro could not place. In this world, the slaves were many things, silent, bruised, tired, but they were not broken. Tiro began to understand that power here was not only held by the dominus, it moved like smoke, unseen. It passed through gossip, through tasks completed with care, through debts repaid in secrets. Survival depended on learning who watched, who whispered, and who punished without warning. In this world of whispers, Tiro found his footing. He watched faces instead of words. He spoke only when addressed. He was not the fastest, nor the strongest, but he was the most precise. And those who are precise are rarely noticed. And those rarely noticed are often spared. The familiar servorum was a machine, but it was made of souls, and Tiro, still a child in body, was no longer a child in mind. Tiro's days soon fell into rhythm, each hour marked by bells, sun, and repetition. His mornings began in darkness, long before the master's first stirrings. He was woken by the sharp whisper of Menander's cane, tapping the floor. No words were needed. The air itself carried the urgency. Tiro would rise silently, splash his face with cold water from a stone basin, and pull on his tunic, coarse wool, grey, always clean. He would begin in the master's cubiculum, dusting the furniture, checking the sandals laid at the foot of the bed, ensuring the braziers still held heat. If the air was too warm, the master would complain. If the water was too cool, the master would frown. A frown from Gaius Livius Faustus was more painful than a beating. It could be remembered, recounted, passed down in the glances of other slaves. At the sound of the first bell, Tiro would hurry to the atrium, light the oil lamps if dawn had not yet coloured the sky, then head to the culina to retrieve the day's breakfast tray. A plate of dates, honeyed bread, soft cheese, and water infused with mint. The kitchen girls moved like shadows, dodging Brannus's commands. Tiro said nothing to them, only nodded when given the tray. He returned to the master's chamber before the second bell, placed the tray on the ivory side table, adjusted the curtain at the window to let just enough light in, not too bright. Then he stood by the wall, still as a statue, eyes lowered. The master would rise when he pleased. Sometimes he would speak. "Boy," he'd say, "bring the scroll," or "wine, watered." Rarely did he look directly at Tiro. He addressed him the way a man might address a writing tablet or a favoured cloak. But the moment the master's voice touched him, Tiro felt it like fire. After the master was dressed, helped into his tunic, sandals laced, belt straightened, Tiro followed a step behind him to the tablinum. There he would stand through dictations, watching the scribe's hand dance across the wax tablet, listening to Latin words he barely understood. Business deals, grain shipments, marriage contracts, legal petitions. Tiro didn't need to understand them. He memorized the cadence, the names, the timing. When the dominus left for the fields or city, Tiro would return to his other duties, folding linens, checking wax seals, polishing bronze lampstands, preparing for the evening bath. He never ran, never dragged his feet. Every motion had to be exact, brisk but silent, obedient but not robotic. Punishments in the villa were not always physical. A mistake could mean extra duty, missed meals, or worst of all, reassignment to the outer quarters. Once, a boy who dropped a silver plate was made to work in the latrines for a month. He came back quiet, thinner, and never spoke again. But there were small kindnesses too. Menanda, though firm, rarely punished twice for the same mistake. If Tiro showed improvement, he would receive a nod. If he completed a task without being told, a rare word, good. One afternoon, Tiro was sent with a letter to a neighbor's villa. A guard escorted him, but the trip, his first beyond the estate since his arrival, was a wonder. The road was lined with cypress trees, and beyond them, open fields where oxen pulled ploughs under the hands of slaves like him, but older, heavier with toil. He passed a fountain carved in the shape of a sea nymph, saw a boy fishing in an irrigation canal, and for a brief moment felt the sun on his face without command. At the neighbor's estate, a young Roman girl, perhaps 12, asked his name. He hesitated, unsure if he should answer. When he did, she laughed. "That's not a Roman name," she said. "You're foreign." He bowed and said nothing. Back at Domus Augusta, he thought of her voice, light, effortless, full of ownership. She would never carry trays, never polish sandals, never fear the master's gaze. That night, lying on his straw mat, he wondered if freedom felt like that voice. He had no word for the feeling, only a growing, quiet ache. The next day, he rose with the same precision, the same silence. But his eyes saw more. He saw that Amma had bruises on her wrist, that Silurus walked with a limp after a silent punishment, that Menanda paused longer at the lararium now, whispering names Tiro did not know, and he began to see the villa not just as marble and duty, but as a world of secrets, carried on the breath of those who could not speak freely. And Tiro listened. In the quiet spaces between his duties, Tiro began to notice things others ignored. A missing amphora here, a servant entering the master's office too quickly, a hand lingering too long on a robe, meant only to be folded. He noticed when the brass lamp near the atrium was relit hours before sundown, and when a scroll that was always left on the tablinum desk had been replaced by a sealed one marked with a different sigil. He never asked questions, but he remembered everything. Meals were another realm of contrast and instruction. Each morning and evening, the kitchen buzzed like a hive of sweat and clatter. Fires roared, knives chopped, and the scent of baked bread, boiled lentils, roasted game, and spiced garum drifted through the corridors. The meals for the family were artful creations. Goose cooked in honey and wine, stuffed dormice with pine nuts, salted mullet with fig glaze. Tiro never tasted these. He only saw them as he carried trays across the villa, balancing silver dishes with trembling precision. The slaves ate separately and simply. Their rations consisted of barley porridge, olives, coarse bread, and on rare occasions, goat cheese or dried figs. Watered wine was sometimes permitted. They sat on stone benches behind the villa, under a crooked olive tree, bowls in hand, speaking little. No one lingered after eating. Work always called again. Tiro did not complain. The food filled his belly, and that was enough. One evening, a dropped clay bowl shattered near his foot. A younger boy, barely 6, trembled with wide eyes, expecting a cuff or worse. Tiro bent down, collected the shards quietly, and passed him his own portion. The boy nodded once, no words, but the gesture spread. By nightfall, Tiro had 3 nods returned to him in the slave quarters, and one older boy left half a slice of bread on his mat. In the world of the enslaved, these were not trifles, they were lifelines. Bathing in the villa was a ritual, one that reflected both Roman obsession with cleanliness and the power of engineering. The private baths were among the finest in the region. Fed by a branch of the Aqua Augusta aqueduct, water flowed into lead-lined cisterns, heated by furnaces deep beneath the villa. The Hippocor system channeled hot air beneath the marble floors, warming the caldarium to a steam-filled haze. Each evening, the master bathed. Tiro prepared the linen towels, fetched unguents of myrrh and olive oil, ensured the strigils were polished and warm. He watched as Gaius Livius Faustus soaked silently in the steam, his thoughts rising like mist. Sometimes the master spoke to Menander about philosophy, quoting Cicero or Epictetus. Sometimes he said nothing at all, only closed his eyes while Tiro poured water over his shoulders. Slaves were allowed to bathe once per week, sometimes less. When it was Tiro's turn, he scrubbed fast, silently, using rough cloth and cold water in the outer chamber. No scents, no oils, no warmth. Yet even that brief moment of cleanliness gave him strength. The scent of smoke and sweat vanished, and for a few minutes he felt like something closer to a person. Religion in the villa was a complex, silent tapestry. Every morning, incense curled upward from the lararium, tiny statues of household gods nestled in an alcove. Tiro learned their names, the Lares who protected the home, the Penates who guarded the hearth, Vesta who kept the flame alive. But beneath the official rites, the slaves carried their own gods, older, stranger ones. Tiro whispered prayers to the spirit of the mountain where he was born. Others knelt to river stones or touched their brows to fire coals. In the slave quarters, symbols were scratched into the walls, eyes, crescents, hands with no fingers. Gaius knew of none of it, or perhaps he knew, and simply allowed it. One night, after the rest had fallen asleep, Tiro sat under the stars behind the stable. The sky above was wide and quiet, no walls to hem it in. He whispered the name of his mother and placed a stone on the ground, smooth and white, beside the wall. Not a shrine, not a rebellion, just memory. He was only a slave, but he remembered who he was, and in Rome, memory could be its own kind of resistance. The seasons passed, marked by the flowering of the almond trees in spring and the golden hum of cicadas in summer. Tiro grew, not just in height, but in awareness. His limbs lengthened, his jaw sharpened, and his mind, sharpened by observation, grew keener than the knives in Brannus's kitchen. He had become a fixture in the master's household, dependable, invisible, precise, but not unfeeling. He noticed when Lucilla, the master's daughter, returned from a visit to Rome, wearing a veil more elaborate than before, and carrying herself with a stiffer spine. She said little, but her eyes were sharp. Once, Tiro caught her watching him as he folded her father's cloak. She didn't look away. Neither did he. She said nothing, but after that day, he was no longer sent to the women's wing. He noticed, too, that Marcus, now nearing manhood, watched the slaves not with curiosity, but entitlement. He was quick to call, slow to thank. He once struck a stable boy with his cane for not bowing fast enough. When Tiro was assigned to carry his sandals to the bath one morning, Marcus smirked and tossed a grape at him. "Catch, boy," he said. Tiro caught it, ate it, and bowed. He heard Marcus laugh as he left the room, amused and disappointed at the same time. In time, the slaves of Domus Augusta began to trust him. Amma, the kitchen girl, once slipped him a slice of fig cake on Saturnalia Eve. Menander began to give him more responsibility, light errands at first, then more delicate tasks, checking the wax seals on private letters, arranging the master's scrolls by topic, polishing the silver mirror used only during visits from senators. The most important moment came the day the master's personal secretary, a wiry Greek named Straton, took ill. Menander, after a long pause, handed Tiro a blank wax tablet and a stylus. "You'll take dictation today," he said. Tiro swallowed hard, bowed, and took his place beside the master's couch. Gaius Livius Faustus raised an eyebrow. "You know your letters?" Tiro nodded. "Enough, Dominus." "Good. Listen well. One mistake, and I'll feed the tablet to your teeth." Tiro pressed the stylus gently into the wax. The words came slow at first, but steady. Gaius dictated a letter to a grain supplier in Cumae. Formal, dry, precise. Tiro's hand trembled, but only once. When the letter was complete, Gaius glanced at the tablet, grunted approval, and turned back to his wine. The next day, Menander handed him a fresh tablet without a word. From that point on, Tiro was not just a cubicularius. He had become useful in a new way, an unofficial scribe, a silent listener, a boy who carried not just sandals and towels, but words. Words were dangerous. He understood that now. Words moved coin, raised tempers, sealed marriages. Words were power, and now some of that power passed through his fingers. But not all words came from masters. In the slave quarters, other voices spoke. One evening, as the sun fell behind the cypress trees, a group of older slaves sat in the shade, whispering stories. One told of a man who had bought his freedom by catching the eye of a noble widow. Another spoke of a slave who had poisoned his master and vanished into the hills. A third, an elderly man named Larth, simply said, "Freedom is for those who stop hoping for it." Tiro listened, but said nothing. Later that night, he found a loose stone in the servant corridor wall. Behind it, hidden in dust, was a coin, small, copper, and worn. No one claimed it. Tiro stared at it in his hand for a long time before putting it back. He had no use for false hope. What he needed was time. Time to learn. Time to wait. Time to become something no one expected. He was still a slave, yes, but no longer just a boy, not just a body. He was a shadow now, moving between words, eyes, and silences. And in Rome, shadows often lived longer than light. Tiro began to understand that within the seeming stillness of the villa, everything moved, slowly, quietly, beneath the surface. Conversations that happened in the triclinium echoed days later in changes to slave duty rosters. A glance shared between Lucilla and a visiting magistrate would bring new wines to the cellar. The expression on Gaius's face after a letter was read aloud could mean a slave would vanish the next morning. Nothing was said. Everything was understood. He learned to walk silently through marble halls, to sense when a room needed fragrance or air. He knew which sandals belonged to which guest before they asked. He knew how many drops of rose oil the Dominus preferred in his bath. He could sense, in the rhythm of footsteps or the stillness in a room, what mood awaited him before he entered. These skills, useless to a free man, were invaluable to a slave in the master's wing. He was now given a small wooden box of tools, a wax stylus, a silver cloth, a small flask of olive oil for polishing, and a pair of sandals he was to maintain perfectly. He treated it like treasure, wrapping each item at night and hiding the box beneath his mat. The other boys saw this and left it alone. They had begun to respect the way he carried himself, never boastful, never fearful. Only Amma, with her quiet eyes and steady hands, spoke to him beyond the boundaries of rank and task. One afternoon, while peeling onions behind the kulina, she said, "You never laugh, even when others joke." "Why?" Tiro hesitated, because nothing is safe enough to laugh at. She didn't smile, but nodded. "Good answer." She stood, wiping her hands, and walked away. But the next morning, he found a peeled apple placed beside his tunic. The master's household was vast, but the bonds between the enslaved were like threads in a tapestry, small, hidden, but strong. One morning, a visitor arrived. He was a senator from Rome, accompanied by 4 guards and a scribe. Tiro was summoned to attend the meeting in the library. He stood near the wall as the men spoke in tones heavy with consequence. Gaius was offering land for lease, something to do with grain prices, temples, and favors owed. But what caught Tiro's attention was a single phrase, muttered at the end of the conversation. "The slaves in the port town are growing restless," said the senator. "Too many mouths, not enough grain. Be ready." "Be ready." The words echoed in Tiro's mind long after the visitor left. Slaves growing restless. He had heard of such things only in whispers. Rebellions in Sicily, riots in mines. But here, in the villa, everything was clean, ordered, precise. Could such unrest reach these marbled halls? He dared not ask anyone, but his eyes became sharper. He noted who spoke too quietly at meals, who vanished during their breaks, who returned with dustier sandals than the paths of the estate would justify. He said nothing, but he watched. And then the unexpected happened. One evening, after Gaius's bath, the master called for wine. Tiro poured carefully, mixing water in the proper ratio. As he turned to leave, the master spoke. "Tiro." The sound of his name on the master's tongue nearly stopped his heart. "Yes, Dominus," he said carefully, his eyes lowered. "You've done well," said Gaius. "Menander tells me you write neatly, and you've broken no vases in months. That's rare." Tiro remained still. "I've decided you'll accompany me to the city tomorrow," the master said. "You'll carry documents and observe the city archives. Watch closely. You'll be useful." He bowed low, breath caught in his throat. The master waved him away. Tiro returned to the quarters that night and lay on his mat, staring at the wooden ceiling beams. He was going to Rome, not just any errand, but to the heart of the empire. The idea filled him with both dread and electricity. He knew the road to Rome was long, the streets wide, the buildings massive. But what he hungered for most was the glimpse of the world beyond his prison. Rome, he thought, was where the chains were forged. And perhaps, if he was patient, it would be where his were broken. The next morning, before the light had crept over the distant hills, Tiro stood at the villa gates, a satchel slung over his shoulder, and a sealed wax tablet in his hands. His tunic had been washed twice the day before. Menander himself had inspected it and dusted the boy's shoulders with fine white chalk. "You're not just carrying words today," he said. "You're carrying the name of Gaius Livius Faustus. Remember that." The journey to Rome began in silence. Tiro sat in the back of the master's covered carriage, while Gaius reclined on silk cushions, dictating notes to Straton, the recovered secretary who had returned to duty, but whose hand still trembled slightly from his illness. Tiro listened closely. He never forgot a word. The road stretched out before them, paved stone gleaming with morning dew. Rows of cypress trees lined their path, casting long shadows that shifted as the sun climbed higher. Traders passed them with carts of olive oil and wine. Farmers led donkeys burdened with baskets. Soldiers in pairs, off duty or on assignment, nodded as they passed. The road to Rome was never empty. As they crested a hill, Tiro saw it for the first time. Rome. Not a city, a sea of stone and glory, sprawling in every direction. Columns rose like trees, aqueducts arched across the sky, and domes shimmered in the haze. Smoke from 1,000 hearths and fires painted the air, and the sounds of wheels, of voices, of bells, reached him like the hum of the earth itself. His heart thudded. They entered the city through the Porta Capena. The streets were tight, lined with insulae, tall apartment blocks where the poor lived like stacked crates, and tabernae that spilled goods onto the streets, bolts of cloth, amphorae of fish sauce, bundles of herbs, cages of geese. Beggars sat beside marble fountains. Street performers balanced daggers or danced on ropes. Tiro had never seen so many people or heard so many tongues. Latin, Greek, Aramaic, something from the Far East. It was like the whole world had been swept into a single stone bowl. They made their way toward the Caelian hill, where the houses grew wider, cleaner, and more heavily guarded. The scent of manure gave way to myrrh. Here, Rome changed. The people wore togas of brighter white, and their slaves moved like smoke, quick, invisible. The carriage stopped before a large domus with bronze gates and a fountain in the shape of a lion's mouth. A guard greeted Gaius and ushered them into a waiting room with couches and scroll racks. Tiro stood by the door while the master entered a meeting with city officials. Hours passed. He did not sit. He watched the sunlight shift across the tiled floor. A boy his age, also a slave, passed with a tray of honeyed cakes and paused when he saw Tiro. "You're new," the boy said. "From Campania," Tiro replied cautiously. "You look like one who listens more than he speaks." "I do." The boy smiled. "Good. You'll live longer." He vanished behind a curtain before Tiro could respond. Later, the master emerged, nodding to Straton, to the archives. They walked through narrow streets toward the tabularium, the city's great record-keeping structure near the Forum. Along the way, they passed temples with marble stairs and painted walls. Priests in gold-trimmed robes walked past beggars who reached with shriveled hands. A procession passed, a group of Vestal virgins, silent and radiant, flanked by guards. All made way for them. Even the pigeons seemed to bow. At the archives, Tiro was given a small stool and ordered to wait while the master examined documents under a scribe's guidance. But he could not help himself. He leaned forward and stared at the walls lined with clay tablets, scrolls, bound volumes on every imaginable topic, property sales, court verdicts, military orders, citizen registries. So many words, so much power. It struck him then, more clearly than ever before, This was how Rome ruled, not by the sword alone, but by names, ledgers, permissions, signatures, histories, to know who owed what, who owned whom, who was free, and who was not. That was true power. He whispered to himself, "They control the world because they remember everything." The journey back to the villa took place in darkness. Gaius dozed. Straton snored. Tiro sat awake, staring out at the stars, his thoughts burning. He had walked the streets of Rome. He had seen the heart of the empire, and he now understood. Freedom could not be taken by force, not by one such as him, but knowledge could unlock doors no iron key ever touched. He would read, he would listen, he would remember every name, every favor, every secret, and when the time came, he would choose not just to be free, he would choose to become dangerous. When the carriage rolled through the villa gates at dawn, the sky was a faint bruise above the olive trees. Tiro stepped down onto the familiar gravel of Domus Augusta and felt, for the first time, that he had returned not as a boy, but as something else, something sharpened. Menander was waiting, arms folded, eyes unreadable. "Did you watch?" he asked, after the master had gone inside. Tiro nodded. "Then you learned." That was all he said before turning to disappear down the colonnade. Tiro stood alone for a moment longer, the sounds of the waking estate swirling around him, tools clinking, a mule braying, water splashing in the fountain. He moved through the halls that morning, like a man seeing his home after a long journey. Every floor tile, every arch, every face was familiar, but different. He knew now how far removed the villa was from the heart of the empire, how quiet and small it was compared to Rome's roaring chaos. But the villa had its own shadows, and Tiro would learn to walk in them. That same week, his duties changed. He was no longer simply a bedroom servant. Gaius had decided he would serve as a junior assistant to Straton, the master's secretary. It was an unprecedented elevation for a boy his age. Whispers followed him in the hallways. Some slaves gave him narrowed eyes, others turned their backs entirely. Straton was not pleased. "I don't need a shadow," he hissed one day as they sat in the scriptorium. "You'll touch nothing unless told. You'll breathe when I say. The master may find you clever, but I find you in the way." Tiro said nothing. He learned quickly. Each day he copied short passages from older letters, petitions to magistrates, receipts for grain, marriage contracts, lists of goods traded with neighboring estates. He dipped the stylus into ink until his fingers were permanently stained. He learned the curves of Roman handwriting, the pacing of formal prose, the legal terms that made a slave a possession or freedman. He began to see patterns. He noticed which names recurred. He noticed that letters to certain houses used warmer phrasing. He saw which families received larger shares of wheat despite paying less. He kept track, not aloud, not in writing, but in memory. He had no ledger, only his mind. At night, back in the slave quarters, Tiro grew quieter. Amma noticed. "You're changing," she said once, not unkindly. "You used to look at people. Now you look through them." Tiro hesitated. "Maybe it's the only way to survive." Amma looked at him for a long time. "Don't lose the parts of you that still feel. Even the masters haven't done that." Then she turned away, leaving him with the cold silence of his mat. In time, Stratton begrudgingly trusted him with more, delivering scrolls, organizing ledgers, even drafting drafts of replies for the master to review. He was careful, never adding his own words, only copying. But the temptation grew. One day, a letter came from the governor's office. A short reply was needed. Approval for a local magistrate's request. Stratton was absent. Gaius glanced at the empty chair. "Write it," he said. Tiro blinked. "Dominus? You've watched me long enough. Write it. Keep it short. Civil. No more than 6 lines." Tiro sat at the desk, hands trembling slightly. He dipped the reed, steadied his breath, and wrote, "To the esteemed Decimus Maximus, the request concerning land boundaries is noted. Approval is granted within the conditions previously discussed. May your efforts continue in the service of Rome. In strength and reason, Gaius Livius Faustus." He pushed the wax tablet forward. Gaius read it, then grunted, "You learn quickly." The tablet was sealed and sent without correction. That night, Tiro stood beneath the olive trees and whispered his mother's name again, not in mourning, but in promise. He would rise, not by sword, not by escape, but by becoming essential. One day, he would walk out of Domus Augusta as more than a freedman. He would walk out as someone no Roman could ignore. Summer brought heat thick as oil, draping itself over the villa's courtyards and hallways, until even the marble floors could not cool a bare foot. The air buzzed with flies and voices, tempers rising with the temperature. Even the master grew impatient, snapping more frequently at Stratton and demanding cold water with crushed herbs several times a day. The slaves moved faster, not out of fear of beatings, though those always loomed, but because the walls themselves seemed to breathe unease. One morning, Menander summoned Tiro before dawn. He stood in the dim antechamber outside the triclinium, dressed in his work tunic, feet bare, hair damp from the fountain basin. "You'll accompany the master to the summer villa," the steward said. "Near Baiae." Tiro blinked. Baiae, a place spoken of in whispers, a coastal retreat where senators played at kings, where the sea glittered like glass, and where discipline often melted with the heat. "Stratton will remain here. You will attend personally. The master wants you near." Tiro bowed his head. He did not ask why, but inwardly he understood. Gaius Livius Faustus, ever the careful hand, was grooming him, not as a son, never that, but as a tool more refined than the rest. And tools, once sharpened, must be tested. The journey to Baiae took 2 days, the heat unrelenting even on the shaded roads. They rode in a covered carriage with painted panels, escorted by 2 bodyguards and 3 servants. Tiro sat at the rear, holding a small chest of scrolls and a pouch of ink vials. He said nothing as they passed villas perched above the sea, their gates carved with the names of old proud families, Corneli, Claudii, Vitelli. When they arrived, Tiro was stunned. The summer villa was a palace. Set into the cliffs overlooking the Bay of Naples, it had its own private harbour, steam-fed baths carved into the rock, and terraces draped in wisteria. Statues of Venus, Apollo, and Bacchus lined the outer gardens, and mosaics of dolphins shimmered on the floors. Musicians played soft flute music in the evenings. Slaves dressed in dyed linen served honey-soaked pastries and frozen fruit. It was, Tiro realized, not a home, but a theatre. Everything was performance. Gaius played his part well. He smiled more, laughed with his guests, drank wine with a loosened tongue. He spoke of politics, of land disputes, of the foolishness of younger senators. But when the guests departed and the lights dimmed, his eyes would harden again, and his commands would come sharp and low. Tiro watched everything. He saw who leaned too close to the master's ear, who asked too many questions, who offered gifts they didn't need to offer. He took mental note of every name, every topic, every raised eyebrow. One guest, a younger senator named Cassius Severus, took a peculiar interest in Tiro. "You read?" the man asked casually one evening, as Tiro poured his wine. "A little, Dominus," Tiro said. "And write?" "If needed." Cassius smiled thinly. "I'd like to borrow him," he told Gaius, lounging in the caldarium steam. "Just for a day. I have letters to dictate." Gaius looked at Tiro for a moment. Number he stays. Cassius didn't press, but the look he gave Tiro was lingering. That night, the master said only, "Be wary of men who smile too easily. Their teeth are rarely clean." Tiro slept on a mat near the master's chambers, close enough to hear the sound of his breathing at night. He no longer dreamed, or if he did, they were shallow things, half-lit and fragile, breaking apart with the first rustle of wind. One morning, as the sun rose red over the sea, the master called for him while still in bed. "You listen," Gaius said. "You obey, but I don't trust you yet." Tiro froze. "Dominus?" "You're not like the others," Gaius said. "You watch everything. You think I don't see that, but I do." Tiro said nothing. "That's good," Gaius continued. "That's why you're still here. But understand this." He leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "I do not keep wolves in my house. If I sense fangs behind your silence, I'll pull them out one by one." He sat back, picked up a fig, and bit into it. "Now," he said, chewing, "fetch the letter from the Greek merchant. I'll dictate a reply." Tiro bowed and left. His heart beat hard in his chest, but not with fear, with clarity. He knew now how Gaius saw him, not as a boy, not even as a servant, but as a weapon. And weapons, in Rome, could be used until they broke, or until they turned. The rest of the summer in Baiae passed like a slow-burning flame, beautiful, intoxicating, dangerous. The villa perched above the sea like a predator waiting for prey. Gaius hosted senators, poets, and merchants, men whose voices shaped grain prices and whispered the names of future consuls. And Tiro, always silent, always present, moved between them like smoke, unseen and yet constantly absorbing. He memorized not just words, but rhythms, how men paused before speaking, lies, how their voices dipped when greed was near. He noticed how the master adjusted his tone depending on the guest. With Cassius Severus, casual and sharp. With Senator Aelius, deferential, but with teeth behind every compliment. With Decimus Longinus, cool and dismissive, for Gaius saw weakness in him and did not hide it. Tiro began to anticipate the master's needs before they were voiced. A towel warmed near the brazier, ink ready before a thought was spoken, sandals prepared facing the right direction to avoid delay. It was not just obedience, it was an art, to serve so precisely that the master forgot he was there at all, to become part of the rhythm of power. But beneath this grace, tension churned. The slaves of the summer villa, were not like those at Domus Augusta. They were hired, borrowed, sometimes leased from other estates for the season. This meant they did not fear long-term punishment. They were more daring, more bitter. In the kitchens, voices rose at night. In the stables, bruises appeared on backs and faces without punishment. No one reported it. Tiro heard whispers of a plan. He never heard names, only fragments. During the next feast, when the guards are drunk, the signal will be the overturned torch. He said nothing. He never joined their circles, but he listened, not out of loyalty to Gaius, but because knowledge was the only true currency a slave could possess. And then, one night, the silence shattered. It was during a feast. The triclinium was filled with music, roasted meats, garlands of bay and lavender. The guests were deep in wine, laughing too loudly. Gaius sat at the head, eyes glazed with drink, but still calculating. Tiro stood behind him, pouring honeyed wine into his goblet. Suddenly, a crash, a scream, a torch overturned by the garden entrance. A slave leapt from behind a pillar, knife flashing. Another overturned the wine table. Chaos erupted, guests stumbling, slaves shouting, a guard knocked down with a clay amphora. Gaius rose slowly, calmly, as if expecting it. "Take the boy," he said to the nearest guard, nodding at Tiro. "Into the library. Bar the doors." Tiro was seized by the arm and dragged into the inner corridor, the sounds of fighting fading behind thick stone. The guard bolted the doors and stood, breath heaving, gladius drawn. "Why me? Tiro Susuro." The guard looked at him, confused. "The master said you were valuable." Tiro stood in the dark, chest rising and falling, heart hammering. He said nothing else. Within an hour, it was over. 2 slaves were dead, 3 wounded. 1 guest had his face slashed. The rest fled in panic. Gaius, untouched, returned to his seat and demanded his wine be reheated. Later, in the quiet, after the flames were extinguished and the bodies removed, Tiro stood near the doorway as Gaius cleaned his hands. "The ambitious ones always move too soon," the master said, not looking up. "Fear is a better leash than kindness, but fear must be earned." He paused. "You didn't run." "No, Dominus." "You didn't scream." "No, Dominus." Gaius studied him. "You're not a boy anymore. You're becoming something else." He stood, walked past Tiro, and added, "Perhaps you're becoming Roman." That night, as Tiro lay alone in the servant's chamber, he stared at the moonlight on the floor. Becoming Roman. The words echoed like a riddle. He thought of his mother's voice, long faded, his village, burned, the chains around his wrists as a child, and now the blood on the flagstones, the dead bodies of men who once whispered rebellion. Becoming Roman did not mean freedom. It meant becoming harder than the chains that held you. It meant surviving not through escape, but through transformation. He didn't know if that was victory or surrender, but he knew this. He would not die a tool. He would become the hand that held one. When they returned to Domus Augusta at the end of the summer, the villa felt smaller than before, tighter, quieter, more controlled. Tiro walked through its halls with the familiarity of someone who had seen the vastness of Rome, the splendor of Baiae, and the shadows behind silk curtains. He carried himself differently now. His steps were confident, his eyes forward, his voice, when required, steady. Menander noticed. "You've changed," he said one evening, as they walked through the peristyle garden, where moonlight shimmered on still water. Tiro didn't answer. "That's not a warning," Menander added. "It's a recognition." Tiro gave the older man a glance. "Why did he choose me?" "To test whether you'd break." "Did I?" Menander's silence was answer enough. That autumn, Tiro's duties deepened. He no longer simply served, he managed. Stratton had taken ill again, and this time the master did not wait for his recovery. Tiro was given full access to the scriptorium. He read letters aloud to the master, wrote replies under dictation, and even signed certain messages with the master's seal under Menander's watch. He was 15 now, lean and angular, his hands ink-stained, his eyes older than his years. Some of the other slaves whispered that he was no longer one of them. They weren't wrong. He ate different food, small portions of spiced lentils, stewed apples, and fresh bread set aside from the master's table. He slept apart now, in a small antechamber near the library. He answered directly to Gaius, and spoke to visiting merchants and minor officials with a voice that carried more weight than theirs. And yet, he was still a slave. When the master raised his voice, he bowed. When the master demanded silence, he offered none. When a mistake was made, by another even, he endured the master's fury, like a stone endures wind. But inside, something hardened. He had begun to collect secrets, not written down, not repeated, only remembered. The senator who visited once a month with unmarked scrolls, the scribe from the temple of Saturn who lingered too long in the library, the letter from the East, written in Greek, but with hidden lines scratched between the wax. The slave girl in the villa who carried the child of a visiting merchant, and whose pregnancy vanished the following week. Tiro said nothing, but he remembered everything, and with each secret his value increased, not just to Gaius, but to himself. Amma still worked in the kitchens, older now, her voice more firm, her hands more calloused. She saw him less often, but when they did meet, their eyes held. One day, in passing, she handed him a folded cloth. Inside it, a small carved figure of wood, rough, but shaped like a laurel leaf. "I made it," she said, "with your name in mind." Tiro held it as though it were a gold coin. He carried it with him, hidden in his belt. One night, as winter approached and the olive trees turned silver in the cold, Gaius summoned Tiro to the study after the evening meal. The fire burned low. The master was not drinking. That alone was a sign. "You've proven yourself," Gaius said, "more than once." Tiro bowed. "I've written your name into my will. If I die before you, unlikely, but possible, you will be freed." Tiro kept his breath even. "You'll be given a tunic, 10 auri, and permitted to take a Roman name of your choosing." Still, Tiro said nothing. Gaius leaned back. "Say something, boy." "I thank you, Dominus," he said quietly, "and I will earn that gift." Gaius studied him. "You already have, but understand something. Freedom is not the end of service. It's simply another form of it. You'll still be tied to me, even then." Tiro nodded. Better to be tied to a name than buried without one. That answer earned a smile. "You've learned to speak like a Roman," Gaius said, "and that may be the most dangerous thing of all." He dismissed him with a flick of the hand. Tiro left the chamber, the laurel carving pressing against his ribs through the cloth. He knew now what path had been set before him. He would serve, yes, but not forever. And when the time came, when the master's name was no longer written above his, when he stepped into the world as a man not owned, not bound, he would rise, not because he had been given freedom, but because he had carved it, word by word, from the very stone of Rome. Winter wrapped Domus Augusta in stillness. The fields lay dormant, cloaked in frost. The fountains slowed. The sky hung low with smoke from the hearths. Life in the villa shifted inward. Fewer guests, longer hours by lamplight, and more time for the silent tasks that kept the estate running. Tiro, now 16, found himself no longer viewed as merely a slave boy. He had become a figure with authority, not by decree, but by presence. The younger slaves watched him closely, mimicking the way he folded scrolls or adjusted his tunic before entering a room. Even the older ones, those bent by years of toil, lowered their voices when he passed. Menander, still the steward of the house, began to withdraw. Whether from age or design, he gave more of his tasks to Tiro: the slave rosters, the grain inventories, the accounting of wine casks and oil jars. Tiro did them all, and more. He had memorized the villa, its passages, its rhythms, its moods. He knew how long it took for bread to rise in the lower ovens, how much wax remained for the lamps, how many steps it took to walk from the atrium to the stables in silence. And now he began to teach. At Gaius's request, Tiro selected 3 younger boys, ages 10 to 12, and began instructing them in basic Latin and numbers. They met in the scriptorium after the evening meal, huddled around low tables by candlelight, their fingers stained with ink, their eyes wide with both fear and hope. He taught them how to form letters, how to count amphorae, how to speak without speaking. He gave them what no one had given him, a pathway out of ignorance. But he also taught them caution. Never show how much you know, he told them. Knowledge in a slave is dangerous unless it serves someone else. They nodded. Be useful, he said. Be silent. Be sharp. They listened. Word of his teaching reached Amma. One evening, she came to him by the garden well. Her hair was tied back, her arms dusted with flour. You're building something, she said. He looked at her, uncertain. Not just a name for yourself, she continued. You're planting something. In them. He lowered his voice. I'm planting survival. Amma shook her head. Number, you're planting memory, and memory leads to hope. They stood in silence, the cold wind fluttering the olive branches above. She reached forward and touched the wooden laurel carving at his belt. I remember when you didn't speak at all, she said. I remember when I didn't know who I was, he answered. She gave him a sad smile. Do you know now? He paused, then nodded. I'm the result of what Rome made, and what it didn't expect to keep alive. The months passed. Tiro began managing the household accounts directly. When traders came, they spoke to him first. When the master's letters returned with replies, Gaius asked his opinion, briefly, always as a test, but asked nonetheless. He was no longer a tool. He was a trusted extension of the master's reach. And yet, he remained owned. Each night, he removed the belt with the wooden carving and folded his tunic. And each night, he felt the invisible weight of the collar he no longer wore, but which still shaped his life. Then, in early spring, Gaius summoned him to the tablinum. The master sat at the desk, a scroll open before him. The wax seal had already been broken. "You've been called," Gaius said. Tiro stood still. "A magistrate in Rome, one of my allies. He needs a steward, a household manager." The words hit like cold water. "You'll go as a slave," Gaius said, "but a trusted one. You'll oversee his villa near the Aventine. You'll have your own chamber, your own writing desk, and if you perform as you have here—" He let the sentence hang. "Manumission will follow." Tiro bowed, slowly, deeply. "Do you want this?" Gaius asked, voice low. Tiro lifted his eyes. "Yes, Dominus." "Then go. Make me proud to have written your name in ink." The next morning he packed his few possessions, a stylus, 2 scrolls of his own scribbling, the wooden carving Amma had given him, and a folded tunic Menander, left without a word. He passed through the gates of Domus Augusta, alone for the first time. No guards, no chains, just a letter bearing the master's seal, and a future not yet written. As he walked down the road toward Rome, the wind rose behind him, lifting dust and memory alike. He did not look back. He had been born in the mountains, sold in the markets, tested in marble halls, forged in silence. Now he was more than a slave. He was a witness to everything Rome was, and everything it had taught him to become. And Rome, in time, would remember his name. The villa on the Aventine was smaller than Domus Augusta, but no less proud. Built on the slope of one of Rome's 7 hills, it overlooked the Tiber and the distant peaks of the Capitoline. Its walls were whitewashed, its columns of local travertine, its gardens less ornate, but carefully kept. It was the home of Lucius Marcius Crispus, a praetor with ambitions for higher office, and the wary eyes of a man who trusted few and owed many. Tiro arrived just after dawn. The house steward, a bald Syrian freedman named Baruch, received him with folded arms and a long look. He did not ask questions. He led Tiro to a small chamber near the back garden, furnished simply with a narrow bed, a table, and luxury beyond imagining for a slave, a small niche for writing. "You are to manage the household staff," Baruch said in Greek. "The master doesn't speak to slaves unless he must. That task falls to me, and now to you." Tiro nodded. "How many in the household?" 18 slaves, 4 freedmen, 2 hired tutors, 1 temperamental cook, and a caged parrot that insults everyone but the master's wife. Tiro said nothing. Baruch studied him for a moment. "You're young." Tiro looked him in the eye. "So were you once." Baruch smiled faintly. "You'll do." That day, Tiro walked every corner of the villa. He memorized its layout, where the walls thinned, where the doors creaked, where the light lingered longest in the afternoon. He met every servant, asked no questions, but heard everything. He could feel the rhythms already, where resistance brewed, where fear slept, where laziness had taken root under the shadow of poor management. He cleaned the rot with quiet force. Within a week, meals were served hot and on time, scrolls properly copied, punishments issued sparingly, but with precision. The parrot stopped squawking as loudly. The master's wife, Junia, mentioned loudly and in passing that things seemed smoother this month. Lucius Crispus himself only spoke to Tiro once in those early days. "You're the one from Faustus's house?" Yes, Dominus. Faustus doesn't waste talent. Don't make me regret listening to him. Tiro bowed, and just like that, he became a presence, the kind of slave no one scolded, no one touched, no one ignored, but his mind remained restless. At night, he wrote in secret, not letters, not records, but his own story. He wrote about the mountain air of Illyria, about his mother's eyes, about the villa in Campania, and the smell of roasted garlic in Brannus's kitchen. He wrote about the first time he held a stylus, the first time he poured wine for a Roman lord, the first time he realized that memory could be sharper than any blade. He hid the scrolls beneath a loose tile in the corner of his room. Weeks passed, then months. One morning, Baruch entered his chamber, holding a scroll. Tiro rose quickly, expecting a reprimand, but Baruch only said, "You've been summoned." By the master? Number by Faustus. Tiro blinked. "He's in the city, wants to see you before he returns to Campania." Tiro changed quickly and followed Baruch into the carriage. The city unfolded before them in a haze of noise and dust, temples rising like teeth, fountains spilling from lion mouths, beggars shouting beside senators in golden brooches. They met at a bathhouse near the Palatine, where the wealthy came not to cleanse, but to scheme. Gaius Livius Faustus sat beneath a painted arch, robe tied loosely at the waist, sandals off, feet soaking in a marble basin. "You've done well," he said, without preamble. "Crispus writes that the household hasn't run this smoothly since his grandfather's day. He says you have a gift for knowing when to speak and when to disappear." Tiro remained silent. "That's good," Faustus continued, "because your time is nearly finished." Tiro's heart stilled. "I'll be returning to Domus Augusta before Saturnalia," Faustus said. "You'll come with me, and when the festival ends, you'll be freed." Tiro inhaled slowly, but did not move. "You've earned it," Faustus said, "and I've earned the pride of having trained something rare. Remember this, freedom is not escape, it is responsibility. Most men waste it. Don't." He stood, water dripping from his feet. "Oh, and think of a Roman name, something respectable, not too grand." Then he turned and walked away. Tiro stood alone in the steam. No chains, no whip, no collar. But the moment was heavier than he imagined. He would be free. Soon. But what would he do with freedom? He no longer had a homeland to return to. No family. No land to till. No gods that could grant him favor. All he had was Rome. And perhaps that was enough. He would walk its streets, not as a shadow, not as a whisper, but as a man with a name. And one day, when the time was right, the world would read that name on more than parchment. They would write it in memory. The villa gleamed in the pale light of early winter, every surface scrubbed, every mosaic polished, every garment starched to perfection. It was Saturnalia, the great festival of reversal and release, where masters served meals to slaves, when games were played and rules were loosened. Laughter echoed through Domus Augusta, and even the sternest overseers allowed themselves smiles. Wine flowed, bread was shared, tokens were exchanged. But for Tiro, it was not merely a festival, it was the eve of freedom. He stood outside the atrium at sunrise, dressed in a tunic of deep grey, not the rough wool of field slaves, nor the fine linen of senators' sons, something in between, a robe of transition. In his hand, He held a sprig of laurel, freshly cut and bound in twine. It was not a symbol required by law, but he had chosen it, to remind himself of what had shaped him, what had nearly broken him, and what had not. Inside the atrium, Gaius Livius Faustus waited, seated upon the ivory-backed chair used only for formal declarations. Menander stood at his right, the household record scroll in hand. A few of the senior slaves gathered near the columns, silent witnesses to the rare moment. Tiro approached and knelt. "Rise," Gaius said. Tiro did. "You have served this house," Gaius said, in silence, with precision and with skill. "You have been beaten, tested, trusted, and you have answered every demand with calm hands and a sharp mind." The words hung in the air. "You are now a man of Rome." Gaius turned to Menander. "Read." Menander unrolled the scroll and recited, "I, Gaius Livius Faustus, citizen of Rome, do hereby declare the man called Tiro, property of this house, to be granted manumission by the will and seal of my household, with the approval of all present. He shall wear the pileus, the cap of the free, and be entered in the record as Tiro Livius." The words were formal, ancient, binding. Menander approached with a white felt cap in his hands. Tiro bowed his head. The cap was placed upon his shorn hair. He was free. The atrium remained silent. A few clapped. Menander bowed his head. Gaius nodded once. Tiro turned and walked out into the morning light. For the first time in his life, no one called after him. No voice demanded he return. No hand reached for a tool or command. He breathed. It was shallow, uncertain. Freedom, he realized, did not feel like joy. It felt like weight, like a door opening onto a vast, dark hall. There were decisions now, endless ones. Where to sleep, what to wear, what to say. He could leave, he could stay, he could vanish, he could rise. That evening, Amma found him near the olive grove. "I heard," she said. "I didn't ask for it," he replied quietly. "I know," she said, "but you earned it." They stood in the quiet for a long time. Then she asked, "Will you leave?" Tiro looked up at the stars. Not yet. And he didn't. Not that night. Not that week. Instead, he began to walk Rome as a freedman. He registered with the local magistrate. He met other liberty, freed slaves who had become merchants, scribes, moneylenders. Some had risen high. Some had sunk lower than when they were owned. Tiro watched them all. He rented a room near the Forum, bare but clean, with a desk and a window. He joined a scribes guild, and within months he was copying contracts for merchants and transcribing letters for senators too busy to write their own. Word spread. He was fast, silent, accurate. He made coin. He kept his head down. But he remembered everything. Every face that once looked past him. Every word spoken as if he were not in the room. Every cruel joke. Every transaction he witnessed as a boy, too afraid to speak. He wrote them down now, not for vengeance, but for memory. He started to write his story, not in the style of Cicero or Livy, but his own way, line by line, a slave's eye, a slave's heart, a freedman's voice. One day, perhaps, it would be read, and those who thought slaves could never remember would find themselves remembered, not with wrath, but with clarity, and history, he believed, would be sharper than any whip. Years passed, not quickly, but steadily, like ink drying on parchment. Tiro Livius, once a child in chains, became a name spoken in the shaded porticos of Rome, not loudly, not yet in the halls of the Senate, but in corners where scribes whispered, where merchants needed contracts resolved, where secrets were bought, not with gold, but with discretion. He never called attention to himself. That was the first rule. He walked the city in plain tunics, no ring on his finger, no ornament in his hair. He greeted freedmen, artisans, grain sellers, and magistrates the same way, with calm, with patience, with memory. He never forgot a voice, never repeated a secret unless it served something greater. His room above the scriptorium grew into a home. He bought the space after 3 years, his first legal property, and kept it sparse. A wooden desk, scroll racks, 2 stools, and a bed stuffed with clean straw. On the shelf, tucked behind a ledger, sat the carving Amma had given him years before, the laurel leaf. He never told anyone its origin. Sometimes at night he would hold it, turning it slowly in his fingers, letting memories settle before he put it back. He never married, not because love eluded him, but because the city was too full of watching eyes, and his work required a kind of solitude most did not understand. He did, however, care for people. He took in apprentices, not many, and never the ones who asked loudly. He chose the quiet ones, the cautious, the broken, children of freed slaves, bastards of senators' housemaids, boys who had seen too much and spoken too little. He taught them how to write, how to count, how to fold a contract so that it looked untouched. He taught them how to listen without reacting, how to remember the order of men's steps, how to hear truth in the middle of a lie. To one boy, shy and wounded, he said, "The world will never ask you how you survived, only what you became." To another, angry and reckless, he said, "Use your rage like a blade, but never show its edge." And slowly, his house of paper and silence grew. He began to receive letters from those who once ignored him. Gaius Livius Faustus, now old and slowed by gout, wrote him yearly from Campania. The first letter had only 1 sentence. "I always knew you'd learn to write your own orders." The last letter came the year Faustus died. In it, he wrote, "You were never a tool. You were a mirror. Rome saw itself in you, and that frightened it." Tiro did not weep. He returned to Domus Augusta one last time to oversee the funeral. The villa was quiet now, fewer servants, gardens untamed, rooms hollow with the echo of decades. Menander was long gone. Amma had left the villa years before, a free woman working in a bakery on the edge of Capua. Tiro passed through the halls like a ghost revisiting a former life. At the funeral, he spoke 1 line before the gathered crowd of nobles and servants. He was a master. I was his servant. We both learned something from the other. Then he left Rome for a time. He traveled the countryside, saw the vineyards of Gaul, the marble baths of Ephesus, the markets of Alexandria. He watched how people lived, how power spoke in every language, and how memory clung to places long after men forgot their names. He returned a quieter man, but he wrote, and what he wrote began to spread. A collection of essays on the silent ones, a small volume of stories called Beneath the Laurel, sold in copied scrolls by young scribes near the Forum. They told the lives of slaves, not with pity, but with clarity. They named no senators, but every one of them felt seen. Some whispered that the anonymous author must be a patrician in disguise. Others said it was a Greek. No one guessed the truth. Tiro never corrected them. He continued his work, contracts, letters, quiet arbitration between merchants and magistrates. He never took bribes. He never raised his voice, but his name became a seal in itself. When he turned 40, a senator offered him a formal seat on his advisory council. Tiro declined. He said, "Counsel offered freely is heard more closely." When he turned 50, he began to teach in the evenings at a small hall by the Tiber. Young men came with questions, and he answered them not with oratory, but with stories. When he turned 60, he walked with a cane, the same walk he once saw in Menander, but his mind remained sharp. He continued to write, and when he died, alone, in the small home he had built with his own labor, his apprentices found his scrolls, hundreds of them, bound in linen, stored with lavender to keep the insects away. The final scroll bore no title, just 2 lines. "I was born with no name and owned by a man of many, but I chose the name they could never take from me, Memory. They buried him without fanfare, beneath an olive tree, but his words remained, and in time Rome remembered him, not as a slave, but as a voice." The scroll was old, but not fragile. Its edges had browned, its seal flaked away long ago, but the ink held fast to the papyrus, each character sharp, deliberate, pressed with care by a steady hand. It sat among hundreds of others in a private archive in Rome, in the home of a young scholar named Publius Verus. He found it by accident. He had come searching for trade records from the late Republic, hoping to track the movement of grain shipments through Capua. Instead, he found a bundle tied with faded red twine, unmarked, tucked in the wrong shelf. Curious, he took it to the reading desk. What he read changed him. The words were not like the speeches of senators or the verses of poets. They carried no grandeur, no myth. They were plain, luminous, filled with things no patrician would write about: the silence of slavery, the taste of barley gruel, the memory of a mother's hands wiping ash from a newborn's cheek. The scrolls told the story of a boy taken in chains, of a villa with marble columns and hidden bruises, of names spoken like currency and lives lived like footnotes. They told of survival, not through strength, but observation, through patience, through the quiet shaping of one's own soul. Publius read through the night. He lit 3 lamps. He forgot his wine. When dawn broke over the forum, he was still reading. He looked for a name. There was no signature at the end, only that final line. "I chose the name they could never take from me, Memory." But one scroll, tucked in the center of the bundle, bore a different line, one that many others missed. "Tiro Livius, freedman of Gaius Livius Faustus." Publius sat back in his chair, the breath gone from him. He had heard the name before, once mentioned in passing by a tutor, as a freedman who wrote legal contracts. Quite accurate. Nothing more. But this was no simple clerk. This was a witness. Over the weeks that followed, Publius returned each night to the scrolls. He began cataloguing them, transcribing them. He spoke to other scholars. At first, few listened. Then more came. A philosopher in Ostia quoted one of the essays aloud during a lecture. A senator's wife copied passages into her private diary. A freedman's son learned to write by copying Tiro's lessons. And slowly the scrolls were passed from hand to hand, not because they flattered the powerful, but because they revealed the world beneath them. They called him the silent chronicler. They called him the slave who remembered. Some scoffed. A few tried to claim the scrolls were forgeries, but no one could match the voice, and none could erase what had already begun. Years later, a small statue was carved, a simple thing, placed not in the forum, but in a quiet square near the Scribes' Guild. It bore no toga, no laurel wreath, just a man seated at a table, head bowed in thought, a stylus in hand. The inscription read, "Tiro lives, born in chains, lived in silence, wrote the truth. Children touched its foot for luck during exams. Old scribes left small ink flasks at its base. No triumph, no parade, but remembrance." And that, in the end, was what he always wanted. Not glory, but to be remembered.